Frontline situation seemed very tough last year, for example, in Kharkov or Kherson. Did the idea of resorting to tactical nuclear weapons ever cross your mind?
What for? Although at the suggestion of the people who were in command of that group then, we decided to withdraw our troops from Kherson. It was not by any means a sign that the front line was collapsing there. Nothing even close to that. The only reason it was done was to avoid unnecessary personnel casualties. That's it. That was the main motive, because in absence of ways of supplying the foothold on the right riverbank, we would have suffered unjustified casualties. To avoid that, a decision was taken to relocate to the left bank. We saw later that we had made the right choice when Ukrainian commanders tried to gain a foothold on the left bank. In Krinky, for example, they were basically pushing people into the meat grinder. There were people running around barefooted there, literally. I mean, literally. They were using speedboats and drones to supply them with ammunition. What is it? It's slaughter. They were sending them to slaughter. Once I asked the Chief of General Staff, and I can tell you there's nothing secret about it. Listen, who do you think is making these decisions on their end? Surely, whoever is making them must realize they're sending people to certain death. He said they do realize. So I asked, why are they making these decisions then? It doesn't make any sense. No sense at all from a military standpoint, he said. Then why? He replied, well, I suppose it comes from the top political leadership, driven by political considerations. They believe that there's a chance of them breaching our defenses. Perhaps they hope to gain additional funds by claiming they have a foothold on the left bank. It's also about presenting their position favorably at international meetings. Once the orders are issued, all the subordinate commanders simply comply. And by the way, the prisoners who surrendered and were taken captive there revealed they had little understanding of the situation they were getting into. When fresh units are deployed there, they're told that the defense is solid there, they're told to keep pushing, to help others out. But they couldn't even make it to the left bank.
A tragedy.
An absolute tragedy from their perspective. So why resort to weapons of mass destruction? There has never been such a necessity.
So this thought has never crossed your mind?
No, why would it? But weapons are made to be used. We adhere to our principles, which dictate that we are ready to deploy any form of weaponry, including those you mentioned, in defense of the Russian state when our sovereignty and independence are under threat. It's all laid out in our strategy, and we haven't changed it.
Mr. President, when the outgoing president, Boris Yeltsin, offered you to run for office, your initial reaction was, I'm not ready.
That's right, those were my exact words.
You have certainly come a long way since then. If you had to write a telegram to yourself at the time, what would it say?
You know, it'd be like a Yankee in King Arthur's court or something. It is impossible to answer this question now. Back then, this question was raised at a certain time, in a certain historical and economic context that the country was in a certain internal political situation that had developed in terms of internal security. And all of that together prompted me to answer, I'm not ready for that. Not because I was afraid of anything, but because the scale of the task at hand was simply enormous. And the number of problems was growing day by day like a snowball. So I gave a frank answer at the time, and not because, I repeat, I was afraid of something, but because I didn't think I was equipped to solve all these problems. And God forbid I would make things worse. That's what it was about. So I said that frankly, and if I were to go back in time, I would have answered in exactly the same way.
What was the decisive factor then? After all, you did run.
Probably conversations with President Yeltsin. What did he tell me back then? He said, okay, fine, I understand. We will return to this later. And we did return to that conversation repeatedly. Eventually, he said, I have vast experience. I know what I'm doing, what I'm suggesting. Well, and there were some other things he said to me. I guess it would be awkward to compliment myself. He said positive things about me. Later, he reiterated it in a very positive way. I won't talk about it now. And when you get to work, it all feels very different. You know, when you work, you think, this, and this must be done immediately, this now, this tomorrow. And so it goes on and on and on. Once you get into it, it's a different story.
There's no time to be afraid anymore.
It is not a matter of being afraid, but of comprehending the issues and being able to solve them. You remember what 1999 was like in the economy, in the field of security, in everything, in finance.
You once mentioned that entering Leningrad State University preparing for this was a turning point for you. It was a situation where you had to go all in, realizing either I do it now and succeed, and then I will fulfill the plans I have, and you intended to work for the KGB at that time already, or I lose, and then everything is different, and the chance is gone. Is Russia now also in a position where you have to go all in?
Firstly, this was not my situation at the time. Yes, I wanted to work in the state security service.
But entering university, was it a turning point? How did it feel? Was it an either-or moment?
Not quite. I just came to the KGB office and said, I would like to work here. How do I do that? The alternative was simple. I was told that I either needed to have a higher education, preferably a law degree, or to have served in the army, or to have at least 3 years of work experience. But it is better to serve in the army. So if I hadn't gotten into university, I would have joined the army. Yes, it would have meant a longer path to the goal I had set for myself, but it was an option. There's always an alternative.
Was it difficult to pass exams?
Yes, of course, because I went to a chemistry and math school. And here I had to pass the liberal arts. So I had to put one thing aside and focus on the other. Yes, of course, it was difficult. I had to learn a foreign language on my own, German in my case. I had to study history, literature, and so on.
But Russia is also at a crossroads right now. It either succeeds or...
Russia is not at a crossroads. It is on the strategic path of its development and will not turn off its path.
To what extent do you feel the support of Russian society in its new capacity? Because Russian society has developed this new capacity, right?
It has been there before, but now it has manifested itself. And it is great that we have given this core Russian society an opportunity to express itself. My feeling is that people have been waiting for this for a long time, that the common man would be called upon by the country, by the state, and the fate of the country would depend on them. And this feeling of an intrinsic connection with the motherland, with your homeland, of playing a vital role in accomplishing its key goals, in this case, in the field of security, is what has brought this might of the Russian and other peoples of Russia to the surface.
Do you feel nurtured by it?
Always. It's not about feeling nurtured by it. What matters is that I see this public demand. This is the most important thing, to meet the public demand.
But it's time to acknowledge that you play a key role not only in Russia, but also globally, because billions of people pin on you their hopes for international justice, for the protection of human dignity and traditional values. What is it like to bear this enormous burden of responsibility?
To be honest with you, I don't feel it at all. I simply work in the interests of Russia, in the interests of our people. I understand, though, what you're talking about, and I'm ready to comment on it. But I don't feel like being the master of the world's destinies. That's not the case. Believe me, not even close. I simply fulfill my duty to Russia and to our people who consider Russia their homeland. As for other countries, it's closely related to how we are perceived worldwide. That's indeed an interesting phenomenon. What's important to note here, and you're absolutely right about this, is that many people around the world seem to be watching us, looking at what's happening in our country, looking at us fight for our national interests. Why is that happening? You may ask, not just because we're formally a member of BRICS or have a history of warm relations with Africa. That is important, yes, but I don't think that's the main point. The point is that this so-called golden billion has essentially been leeching off of other nations for at least 5 centuries now. They tore apart entire African nations, exploited Latin American and Asian countries. Nobody has forgotten that. And I have a feeling that it's not just the leadership of these countries, although that's very important too, but also the ordinary citizens who feel it in their bones, who know what is happening in reality. And our struggle for our independence and true sovereignty nurtures their own hopes for their nation's sovereignty and independent development. It's all further accelerated by Western elites' persistent desire to keep the existing status quo, the unjust state of international affairs. Over the centuries, they've become accustomed to filling their bellies with human flesh and their pockets with money. But even they must understand that the vampire ball is ending.
Are you hinting at there, as you put it in your address, colonial practices? Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what's happening.
You've just painted a completely fair picture of people seeing some hope in Russia. But how did it happen that Western propaganda, with all its might, colossal resources and tools, has failed to cancel out Russia by completely isolating it and distorting its image, even though it tried in the minds of billions of people? How did it happen?
It's because what I mentioned just now is more important to people. It's what people all over the world feel in their hearts. They don't even need pragmatic explanations for the unfolding events.
Even despite this whole flood of mud?
Yes, indeed, but they are also fooling people in their own countries, and it works. In many countries, they believe that it serves their interest because they don't want to have such a huge country as Russia at their borders, the world's largest country in terms of territory and the largest in Europe in terms of population. Our population is not that big in global terms compared to China or India, but we're the most populous country in Europe. And now we're the 5th largest economy in the world. Why would they want such a competitor? They think it's better to do as some American experts suggested, to divide Russia into 3, 4, or 5 parts. That way it would be better for everyone. That's what they're thinking. And they are blinded by this. Well, at least part of the Western elites is blinded by their Russophobia. They were happy to have brought us to the point where we attempted to use force in order to stop the war unleashed by the West in Ukraine since 2014 and had to launch a special military operation. They were overjoyed, I think, because they thought that's how they finally do away with Russia, with this barrage of sanctions, almost a sanctions war declared against us, with the war waged by the hands of Ukrainian nationalists assisted by Western weapons. They thought they would finish off Russia. That's where the slogan came from, the call to inflict a strategic defeat upon Russia on the battlefield. But later came the realization that this was unlikely and even totally impossible. They realized that instead of inflicting a strategic defeat, they were faced with impotence, despite relying on the power of the almighty United States. They found themselves impotent against the unity of the Russian people, the fundamentals of the Russian financial and economic system, its stability, and the growing capabilities of Russia's armed forces. And that's when they started thinking, those who are smarter, about the need to change their Russia strategy. That's when ideas emerged to restart the negotiating process, to look for ways to end this conflict, and to find where Russia's real interests lie. These are dangerous people, by the way, because it's easier to fight those who are guided by lowly principles. Remember what they used to say in Old Russ? That some people's notion of common everyday happiness was limited to having enough to eat and drink and a nose full of snuff. It's easier to deal with such people, those who only care to have enough food and drink, and their nose full of snuff, meaning they used to sniff tobacco. Now it's cocaine up their noses, right? But it doesn't matter, it's easier with such people. But the smart ones are harder to deal with, they're more dangerous, because they influence people's mindset, including that of our people. They promote their whims, disguising them as carrots for us. You noted this already when you asked about the possibility of a negotiating process, but that's also where the disagreements within the Western community stem from. It's an obvious thing. We're not going to split them up, they'll do that themselves with brilliance. but we will certainly guard our interests.
Соблюдение наших интересов.
I can't help asking, Mr. Putin, about the attacks on the Belgorod and Kursk regions. The military actions taking place in the Russian regions. The adversary has become more brazen. Do they sense something? Why is that?
Объяснение очень простое.
The explanation is very simple. All of this is happening because of their failures on the front line. They haven't achieved any of the goals they set for themselves last year. Moreover, our armed forces have completely seized the initiative. Everyone knows this, everyone acknowledges this. I believe there's nothing new here, but they need to show something to compensate for those failures, primarily focusing on the information aspect. Along the state border, the adversary attempted to attack primarily with sabotage groups. The latest report from the General Staff talks about up to 300 people, including foreign mercenaries. The enemy's losses amounted to over 200 people, around 230. Of the 8 tanks deployed, the enemy lost 7. And of the 9 armored vehicles, 7 of which were the US-made Bradleys. Other armored vehicles were also used, mainly to transport personnel. They bring them, drop off, and immediately leave. I'm speaking about the Belgorod section of the border. A bit further south, it's much smaller in scale, I believe. But nevertheless, I'm sure that their main goal is to disrupt the presidential elections in Russia, or at least interfere with the process of citizens' expression of will. This is number 1. Number 2, it's the information aspect I mentioned earlier. And number 3, if anything works out, they are hoping to get a chance, a point of advantage, a trump card in the future negotiation process. We'll return this to you if you agree to return this to us. As I said before, it's easier to deal with people whose main concern is to have enough to eat, drink, and sniff, because you can foretell what they're going to do. They will also do this in some other areas. We can see that.
Mr. Putin, we've mentioned the episode when you saved your children from a fire, and now you already have grandchildren. What kind of country would you like to leave to your grandchildren?
You know, at the first stage, we need to complete everything that was announced in the address to the Federal Assembly a few days ago. We have big and concrete plans related to economic growth, the social sphere, support for motherhood, childhood, families with children, and pensioners. We've talked very little or not at all about this lately, but we're allocating the resources needed for that. I'm talking about pension indexing, various social benefits, long-term care for people who need it. And I would like to say that it's to the older generation that we owe the fairly solid and stable statehood and economy that we have today. Because Russia's economy managed to endure all the ups and downs, the severe hardships of the 1990s, thanks to the heroic efforts of these people during the economic recovery after the Great Patriotic War. Therefore, we should never forget about the merits of the older generation. We should always remember and give them due credit, providing for their well-being today. But the future belongs to our children, so I've already talked about motherhood and childhood programs. But to do all this, we need to rely on the economy, and I hope to see it more technologically advanced, modern, based on the latest achievements in science and technology, IT, AI, robotics, genetics, and so on. Look how fast our agriculture is growing, and there too, modern technologies are needed. They are actively used and will continue to be used. And of course, the country will be self-sufficient in terms of national security and defense. We need to multiply all of this many times over, and the future will be secured.
Thank you, Mr. Putin. Your confidence is contagious. I wish you success in your noble endeavors.
Thank you.